and all this, and he wanted to finish that up this morning. But it turns out, of course, I told you at the last meeting that we had 118 Olson today, but they didn't have anything for us on Wednesday. So I thought, well, rather than to use 118 for lecture and then have to go back to the other room for slides, we would just interrupt Ali's lectures and give the slide series this morning. So he'll continue on Wednesday. We're supposed to have lab this afternoon. Who knows anything about the weather forecast? Is it going to rain or clear? Drizzle? It's not. Well, if it doesn't rain anymore, or any appreciable amount other than just a little sprinkling, we'll come prepared this afternoon to go to the lab. If it really cuts loose and rains, so that you're cut out of this lab, how many of you could make it, Monday section now, how many of you could not make it tomorrow? How many could not make it on Wednesday? I'd still leave 4. Well, if it cut loose and rains, I guess we'll just have to postpone it and take this Monday group out on Wednesday, since we're not having a Tuesday and Wednesday lab section this week. Tuesday and Wednesday sections are out. So all we have to take care of is this Monday group. If it doesn't rain more than just a few sprinkles, we'll go out this afternoon. If it cut loose and really rains, we'll have the lab Wednesday afternoon for those who can make it. Now this morning, I wanted to give you a real fast rundown on training of vines. You've had this out in the lab, at least the dormant season part of it. And we have a pointer in here. Anybody have a ruler with them? So nothing, huh? Pencils off. Who's got an umbrella over there? Yeah. I can't walk that far. Now, you've got the reading assignment, and you know what you're supposed to learn in that, all about the purposes and what you do in the spring and the summer and so forth for the first 3 years and all this business. So I'm holding you for that, and I'm not going to go over that at all. What we're going to do is go through this slide series fairly rapidly so you can get a sequence of planting to summer to winter to summer to winter to summer. Okay? So at any time through it, if you have a question, yell out. We can't spend too much time on discussion of a single point, but we might make a comment or two. So with that, let's just go into them, okay? Lights off back there and here. Okay, now some of you have asked about digging, and I've said, well, you can dig them by hand. Here's one way we dug them in Mexico in a real nice light sandy soil, and with 25 cents an hour labor, you can dig them like this. Cut off the tops, dig down each side fairly deep, 2 or 3 feet, and then just push this wedge out. I got down in this trench and just leaned my back against it and pushed back, and I could push out 6 or 8 at a time, and then we pull them out. So that's one way to dig your rootings. We're getting ready to plant this vineyard. Next slide, please. Or you can use a mechanical digger. This is the one that, what is this thing here? Can anybody get it out of the way? Huh? It is? Okay. Some guy's head, I guess. This is a nursery digger. Many of you have seen it out there in the vineyard. This thing, remember, is about 12 inches wide, and it's sharpened on the front side, and then you lower this into the soil, straddling the nursery row, and this thing comes up behind it at an angle about like this, and then the sharp edge cuts the roots, and this thing lifts them up about this high and then drops them so that they're just sitting there in loose dirt so that you can pull them out by hand. Next slide. And this is a simulated version of how it works. I wanted the picture so they just stuck cuttings in the ground, but it gives you an idea. See, this would just pull them right up and lift them up. Then you can just shake them loose and pull them out. That's the commercial way of digging. Next slide. All right, here's your rootings, some super duper number ones, some big daddies, as Dr. Alley would say. And this shows you the nice rooting that you get at the base of the cutting, and the fact that you get most of your roots formed at the nodes as you go up. That's one reason. The other, of course, is stored carbohydrates for getting 2 or 3 nodes in a cutting, because you get most of your roots at the nodes. And someone in the vineyard the other day was asked, well, what do we do with these upper roots here when you have rootings to plant? And we usually cut all those off and trim these back as shown in the next slide. So here we are ready to plant. We prune those back to about 8 to 10 inches and cut all the roots up in here down off. Occasionally, if you've got a good long rooting, and maybe you've got a root maybe just one node above, it's a nice root, you might leave one like that. But the length at which you cut these roots back depends entirely on how much time and money you want to put into planting. Ideally, if you want the best vine possible, you would have planted those previous vines just the way they were. But you dig a hole about 3 feet across and about 3 feet deep and spend about an hour planting it. Or you can cut them back as we did here, and then this makes about 12 inches across and a hole and planting with a shovel. Or a lot of growers then cut these back to about 2 inches and stuff them into just a augured hole, a small augured hole, or even cut them way back and then just use a piece of pipe onto a spray rig with high pressure water and just push that right down into the ground and pull it out, and then just stick this rooting right down into the hole where they've been cut back just a half an inch or so. And as obviously, the more roots you leave on it, the quicker and better growth you get. I was telling some of you out in the field that I took this kind of vines in Mexico, and I had, by the first week of August, they were up to the top of the stake, cut off, the cordons out 6 feet, 7 feet in each direction by the 1st of August, so we could cut them off. As I'll show you later on, I'll remind you that those were done at that time. Okay, now we're ready to plant. Go ahead. Here's a staked out vineyard in Napa Valley. This happened to be staked for close planting, twice as close as we should be. And we're planting over here. They're out here drilling the holes, and we're planting to pegs, to stakes. You can plant in various ways. You can stake the vineyard first if you've got that kind of money. You can put in little 1-by-1, 2-foot-long pegs and plant to those and leave them in permanently as markers. Or you can put in these little garden labels and plant. That lines you up and gets you set up for planting. Any of those 3 ways that you want to do. The main reason I want to show this slide, see the tractor out here working, see us over here digging holes. These holes were augured the day before. Now let's see this day, and the next morning when we go to plant this, and I want to show that slide again, Kurt, the one that was just there. This is the next morning when we go back to plant. That's what I mean when I say over in Napa Valley you have high water table, and the water is coming off these hills transversely right underneath here, underneath the soil. On top they're out here cultivating, and the next morning you got a water table at 2 feet, a puddle of water. So this is one of the things you have to watch in planting in some of these areas in Napa Valley, these high water table areas. It's a unique situation over there, but that's our vineyards, our university vineyards. We're planting and driving the tractor, yet with water you can make a well 2 feet deep. Next slide. And then on from there. So we had to plan into that. Next slide. All right, I skipped there the summertime growth of that. During the first summer, remember, you don't do anything. That's the normal rule. This is an unusually good, healthy growth for the first year, and you might question whether or not they might have taken, that's a shadow from here, might have taken this one and tied it up and trained it. But you can try that in this area, and half your vineyard will make it and half of it won't. So it's better from a practical economic standpoint just to let everything go and prune everything back to 2-bud spur in the following winter. So this is the type of growth you can get with good rootings here at Davis. Okay, next slide. All right, here we are, pruned back once again to 2 buds. This one may be faked a little bit. I think it may be the first year cutting, but it starts us out pruned back to so-called 2 buds. And that's what you did in the lab last week, what the Monday section will do this afternoon, prune back to 2 buds. Okay, next slide. All right, along about 6 weeks from now, those 2 buds that we talk about, and I told you don't worry about whether you leave 1 bud or 2 buds because you're going to get a great number of shoots coming out of there. So when you get enough shoots out of this vine so that you can easily tie one to the stake, then you pick out the one, not necessarily the longest, but the one that is easiest to tie to the stake. In this case, probably this one. Instead of this one out here, because you could use either one of these, but you're not so much worried about whether one is 6 inches long and the other or not. You wouldn't want to come out and pick this one up and try to pull it up because you'll snap it off. So you want to get one that goes closest and straightest right at that stake. And now, in commercial practices, you do that, pick the best one, and then to cut all the others off, or break them off. But I'm a pessimist, and especially with students. So what I do is have you take the best one, and I think this would be a good practice with your expensive vines in today's production, is to take the best one and tie it up, and then take your second best one, and let's say it's going to be this one, and then cut it off back to about here. But cut it off, everything is little tiny details. Cut it off so that you cut it with a leaf pointing toward the stake. That means then that when that bud comes out, it'll be easier to train it toward the stake. Don't cut it here so that this, that's a cluster, but don't cut it so that this is the shoot that you're going to have to pull over into line. My point in leaving one and one for insurance is that sometimes you break this when you're tying it and you can't tell it. It's so sneaky on you that you can break that and never notice it. So if you break it off and that's the only one you got left, you had it. But if you leave this, you've got to come back a week or 10 days later and tie up again. So when you come back a week or 10 days later, if this one is still okay, then you can snap off your insurance one. Okay, next slide. Oops, I'm sorry, Kurt. I hope the rest of them aren't upside down. Okay, now here we are with all those shoots broken off and the selected one tied up. And you see we already tied it 3 times. This was tied like some of you did the other day to pull the dormant stump in close to the trunk. And then this one was long enough so we put 2 ties on it. Notice some of you get excited about the fact that you see clusters on these young vines already. See, this one has 2 clusters on already. And when you tie it up, of course, you got to break those clusters off. You don't want any fruit this year. All you're trying to do is get that minimum trunk. So you break off those clusters and you break out these lateral shoots. You don't break off the leaves. You break off the shoots, the lateral shoots that are starting to grow, and the clusters as you tie up. Next slide. Well, then that whole bunch is upside down. Here, I guess you turn it around from there on. Okay, then I've left one out of here. I couldn't get the one that lost it somewhere. But you take that one shoot, tie it up repeatedly till you get it up. This is head train now. We're going through a head train series until you get it about 12 or 18 inches above the top of the stake. Then you cut it back, leaving yourself that long internode, and cut it just before you get to the next bud, and even right through the bud, so that next winter you can tie through there to tie it up. This is the poor one. This one should have been tied right around the top of that. But you see the number of ties you put in here. This is relatively few. 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually, quite often you can get 6 or 8 trips through the vineyard to tie it up, about every 6 or 8 inches. To tie it up to a single shoot coming up on a root that is in its 2nd year. Okay, next slide. So this way it looks then a few weeks later, after you've cut the top off, those top 3 or 4 laterals start to push out. When I say pull out the laterals, down as you're training the shoot up, remember my famous story is you don't want to pull the laterals out up above where you want it. Any farther up than you don't want to pull out the ones that you want to keep. A head trained vine, you should pull the laterals off up about knee high. On a cordon trained vine, you ought to pull them off up about another, up to about pocket high, or 2 or 3 shoots below where you're going to have the wire. And that's the way you let the vine grow for the rest of the year. Head training is pretty simple. You should cut these back, cut them, if you want to keep the shoots, cut them back a little bit, or else just pull the laterals out and leave the leaves. Okay, next slide. Now here it is in the wintertime. If it's done, well, there's one out of line there. Well, this is, I think you'll see this before it's pruned in the next slide. But this is a nicely trained young Zinfandel in which the shoots were all pulled off below knee high, and you got 4 real nice canes at the top, and they've been pruned back to 2-bud spur. And we'll tie this now through the stump over here, leaving this as a spur, this here, and then we'll put what we call a belly tie around here to keep, because this vine's going to have 8 or 10 pounds of fruit on it this year, and with that much fruit on it, and just holding it here, it's liable to sag. So we put a tie around to this slot so that it won't slip down, and put a loose tie there and a real tight tie there. Next slide. Now, this is what happens if you don't take those laterals off at the base of the shoot, base of the shoot that you're training up. And you see what a mess you get into? If you do not pull these laterals off when they first come out, when you're tying it up, you get this type of a mess. And you get big, nice shoots down here because they start early, and they tend to get a lot of nutrition. They get a good start. This other is still trying to go up to the top of the stake. So any little laterals up in here are having a hard time making it. What are you going to do with a mess like that? It's a mess. And all because you didn't go through there when you're tying up and break out those laterals. And break them out knee high if you're going to head train it, pocket high if you're going to cordon it, or cane it, cordon it or cane it, and leaving only the top 3 or 4 in either case. But that's a mess. That's one of those nice French column bars that we were talking about, but it could have been better if these had been pulled out. We'd have had some nice shoots up here like you saw in that previous slide on the one that had been done properly. Next slide. And that's the only way you can prune that thing. And now next year these are going to be twice as large, and if you cut them off, you're going to leave big scars, big areas to dry into the trunk and so on, and you're still trying to get your head trained up here. So that business of taking the laterals out in that first few months, here at Davis it'd be during that month of June and July, is extremely important if you want to get a decent trained vine. Next slide. Now here's that first one that we're looking at. Because I want you to get a mental picture of this whole season, I'm trying to show you how what you might expect later on. And here you can see how the shoots are beginning to come out now, and you've got a nice head already properly located up there. You should have gone through about this time of the year and again break out any suckers or shoots that are beginning to come out on this trunk to keep the head up in that area where you want it. Next slide. And here's just that same vine, or one typical of it, a little later in the season, and you should go through then and wipe off these just real quickly. You walk through the vineyard just practically, sometimes you think it's hardly worthwhile to walk through it, but it is worthwhile, even though you do it at a fast walk, because you just walk up and break your hand down on those and yank them off. Okay, next slide. Okay, now that was we're into the second year. Now this is the end of the second year's growth, and we're ready to prune it and really begin to make a head. And I label this so that you get some idea which canes we would keep. You see, we're going to keep, this is a spur, here, 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 here. We're going to keep 6 spurs on that vine and take all the rest of it off. Now leave this in the slide, if you will, Dr. Alley, and then show the next one, and then we'll flip it back and forth a time or two so they get an idea. This is that vine prune. You see, there's our 6 spurs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now look at it and flip it back now to the next one. Get an idea where they are. Now show it again. And there's our 6 spurs that we've left. And we've left, in this case, we've left a 3-bud spur because we want to, I told you, some of you out in the field, that one way you can do, what you're trying to do in training head-trained vines is that you want to explode the head, get it out wide open as soon as possible in the first 2 or 3 years, and then get it out to fill up the volume that you're going to assign that head of that prune vine. And then after that, you've got to fight to keep it within those limits. So you can, if you want to, leave 3-bud spurs and then go back and do some what we call crown suckering and pull off to leave only a couple of shoots, the terminal 2 shoots, to spread your head out that much quicker. But it's a little extra work, just a little finesse technique, but it would help. In this case, we've left 3-bud spurs in most cases. Next slide. Here's that vine as it begins to grow in the spring. You see the terminal buds are pushing first, and nearly every case. And that's about the only thing I wanted to show on it, and show you how it's starting to grow now. Okay, next slide. And here it is just a little later. Can you focus just a little on that, Kurt? So about this time, if you're going to do any sort of thinning of shoots or crown suckering, this would be the time to do it. It's a little bit too early if you were going to do any cluster thinning, because the clusters are just barely beginning to show. Okay, next slide. And this is just to show a variation, another vine of that type, one a little more of what we call vertical cordon, because you had to use the wood that was there. This might better have been pulled off as a lateral shoot in the growing season so that you would concentrate the head. But remember, I tell you sometimes you've got to leave essentially in young vines what we call a vertical cordon, but your objective from then on is to work at it to gradually remove this, maybe remove that, to make this here your framework of the head of the vine, to make this wagon wheel effect, to flatten it vertically. But don't start out with a vertical thing like this where you have to have it vertical in order to get fruiting wood and then leave it that way. Otherwise you get in this old vertical cordon business, which the next slide will show, as you recall. See, now this grower is already pretty well stuck with his vertical cordon. That's what you don't want, this business of a vertical cordon, because these will gradually die out and you'll get more, gradually you get better and better wood up in the top. And then you're just going to raise the thing on up and up. So if you have to start out with a vertical cordon in order to maintain, to control the vigor of the vine when it's young, don't make the mistake of leaving it that way. Keep in mind that you want to work at flattening it over the next 3 or 4 years. Okay, next slide. And yeah, I want to show that one. That's the way it is. It just looks upside down. Not this is I told you one of the problems out there with our French columbine, and one of the reasons why Mr. Tyree likes to train those vines a little bit low is our north winds, and especially with French columbine as vigorous as it is, and this is a result of the north wind on this very vigorous growing French columbine one year out here. It just went in, and the wind just went through there and played havoc with the whole vineyard. You don't have to crown sucker. The wind did it for you. Okay, next slide. Is that the end of that? No. Okay, now that's head training. What we just went through was all head training. And the only difference between head training and cane and training heads for cane pruning is that you're going to raise the whole thing up a little higher so you can put it on a wire. And here I'm trying to illustrate the proper height at which to head a Thompson seedless vine to make a cane. You see, here's a cross-arm trellis, and this isn't a very good picture, but here's the top of here's your last bud, say about 8 or 10 inches below the cross-arm. I've got a knife there across the top to show you the top of the stub, and the stub there would be tied then, and that's the proper height. This all came up in the current year in which the picture was taken, and had been topped when this thing was about 2 or 3 feet up there, cut off here, and then we'll get nice shoots out of the top here. You can see them here coming already here, and I don't see any others at the moment, but you don't notice any down here. They've done a good job of pulling out the laterals. This is down at our Kearney station, where you get good rapid growth in a region 5. Next slide. Okay, this is just an old slide, but it shows you what happens at the end of the year on that type of training. I told you, you've done this out in the field, where if it's a good strong one, you leave 1 cane and 3 or 4 spurs. And then from then on, you gradually increase the canes and to where you get about an even proportion of canes to spurs. The next slide. As you see here now we're up to 3 canes, and we've got 4 spurs. And that's still not quite mature, but the next slide shows you a mature vineyard. You've seen this slide before, with its 4 canes on a sloping cross arm, and putting the canes on the 2 middle wires to get the fruit best exposed for working on. Next slide. And this is just a close-up. Again, you've seen this one, showing, if you can focus a little bit, Kurt, this shows you 2 of the 4 canes on a Thompson seedless 4-wire sloping trellis, and gives you some idea of the terrific amount of fruit you're going to have on there when you consider nearly every one of these shoots is going to, they'll average at least 1.5 clusters per shoot. So this is table fruit, and they'll go through and thin these down. If you figure in here, you'll usually get about 60 to 80 clusters on a properly nourished, properly harvested, or properly cropped vine. And for table Thompsons, they'll take off about, from that 60 or 80, they'll cut it down to about 20 or 24 clusters. So the ground sometimes looks pretty green with clusters of fruit after bloom. This is not to increase that, just to lighten crop load. Okay, is that the last of that? Okay. Okay, any comments or any questions at this point? Because then we'll spend the whole we'll go right through this again with cordon.
The question is, if you stake the vineyard first, what are those little markers in there? When would you want to stake the vineyard?
Stake it. You have to stake it the next year, because you're going to take it up the stake the next year. The first year you don't have to have stakes. You're just going to let them grow, just sprawl on the ground. But the next year, when you cut it back to 2 buds, your whole purpose is to pull 1 shoot up that stake. So you got to get the stakes in there. And if you, well, I'll make a comment later on that about the wires. But you've got to have the stakes in there that second year for sure. So you got to get them in usually during the winter time, at the end of the first growing season. Some people wait too long, have trouble getting stakes, and they're out there trying to stake the vineyard along in April, and they're breaking off shoots and having some difficulty in getting, if you don't get out there early enough to select that single shoot and tie it up, they fall over. And then when you try to bring them up to tie them, you snap them off. So you should get out there and tie those things up before they fall over. As soon as it's long enough to tie easily, one shoot, you should tie it. But don't go out and figure that you're going to save energy for that one shoot by pulling everything off when the shoot is only 6 inches long and leave one shoot there sitting there by itself untied, because these north winds will snap it off, or any wind, wherever you might be. Leave them all there as a bush like that until one at least is long enough to tie. Okay, you got the next series ready? All right, now this series I'm going to do a little bit different, because I want to bring in, the other was as though we were using own-rooted vines. Now I'm going to duplicate a little bit here, because we're assuming on this series now that we're starting out with budded vines. Vines that were budded last fall. You put in a chip bud, as Dr. Alley had you do in lab, but you did it out in the field. You covered this up with dirt. You pruned back part of the tops, pruned the top back rather severely. And now here it is in the spring when the rootstock is beginning to grow. And it's time to uncover that bud and see how much of a success or failure you made of it. So we dig the soil away, pull it back from the vine like this. And the next slide. See, where are we? Yeah. Yeah, I'm up so close I can't see. Yeah. It still looks funny to me up here. Yeah. Okay, so he's pulling it on, and he's cutting the top off here. And here's the plant. So apparently the bud is going to take. I'm not sure whether the bud's in. Right at the tip. Boy, I put my glasses. Well, if all of you can see it, that's the important thing. He's got it turned over sideways. Okay, next slide. Okay, we've cut that off then. When the bud's taken, it's going to grow. Let's see the next slide. And what we do is put a collar around it to protect it from, we put this collar around it. Most often nowadays they don't use this type of thing. This is just a piece of roofing tar paper, 8-inch square, and we roll it. I mean, it's a little cumbersome, a little awkward to put around this for one person. So what you see done now, mostly in the coastal counties, are these half-gallon milk cartons with the bottom cut out, and they just stick those down over the top. And this is done for several reasons. One thing, of course, it tends to protect that bud a little bit from wind or any mechanical damage, and partly perhaps a little bit from rabbits when it's first coming out, and cutworms are quite a problem. And by putting that collar around it, the cutworm either has to be in there to start with, or he has to climb over this thing to get to it. So you stick that milk carton down around it, or a piece of paper like this, something to protect it. And then finally, as much as anything else, if it's shaded around the sides like that, it doesn't tend to, as I said before, sprawl and grow over like this. It has to seek light, and it tends to grow straight up out of that tube. Next slide. As you see here, see, we've just opened the collar back. Can you focus a little? So here's this budded vine then with the collar just opened up to show you how it's coming out and how this collar is forcing it to grow up this way. And remember, this bud, see, is toward the stake over here, so that it'll go right toward the vine. You usually want to bud toward the stake if you can. Next slide.
Dr. Cook,
Yes?
on the three slides previously, the top of the rootstock was cut off. Don't they break back the rootstock shoots sometimes if the bud has to push?
Break it back?
Yeah, on the rootstock.
No, we just trim it back because,
It was cut all the way off.
well, it looked like it was cut all the way off, but it had been cut back to basal buds, back to about a half-inch basals, and then all those basal whorl of buds had come out, so it looked like the whole thing had been cut off. No, we don't break the tops for grapes. We do for citrus and things like this, and some of those things to break the top to force a bud, but here we just prune it back severely. Okay, that answered well enough? Okay, well, okay, next slide. So here we are. We just opened that up to show you how it was. Here it is a few weeks later. Can you focus a little? And you see, here it's out of the tube now, and it's going up the vine. We've tied it once, so it's on its way, just like those others. Here it's got a cluster on it. You say, well, gee, it was just a chipped bud. How come it's got a cluster on it? Well, that chipped bud might have been a fruitful bud. It was in this case. So you've got a cluster coming out of that shoot, which has to be taken off. Next slide. And here it is a few weeks later, going up the chute. And this is going to be cordon trained now, so you can see where the wires are. And here we are. It's been well tied up, but what's wrong with it? They have not pulled the laterals off. So you've got to pull these laterals off, but once again, you don't want to pull them off all the way up. You want to save these last two, or as I say, since I'm a pessimist, I like to save the top three. The top three below the wire, you don't want to yank out. You want to pull off all the rest of the laterals. Okay, next slide. As has been done here. You see, we pull all the laterals off now, and this is what you should do is you tie up. Each time as you tie up, rather than leave it all as we did there just to get the picture, every time you tie up, you ought to break those laterals off as soon as you can, long enough to push them out with your finger, except remembering you want to keep the top 2 or 3. I would have kept 3, but they kept only 2 here. So this thing now you see, here's where we want the cordon, and this thing is about 2 feet or so above it. I keep emphasizing you want 2 feet or so because if you just break off if you have this thing and the tip and the terminal growth is right here, and then you just break it off and then you cut it off here, you don't do a thing. You just stop the growth for a little while, and then this shoot takes over and becomes the main shoot. You've got to give this whole vine a big shock and cut it way back to where you've got buds which are more or less all uniform and mature. Then you'll get 3 or 4 of them to break and give you this head or shoot that you want. But if you just take off 6 inches or even as much as a foot sometimes, you don't do a thing except slow the growth. That's what we call tipping. And it doesn't do a thing except slow the growth down for a little while, and then this terminal with polarity effect takes over and becomes the main shoot. You've got to let that get out there long enough to give you a real shock effect to cause several of these to really take off and grow. So this has already been determined that those 2 are going to become the cordons. So let's see the next slide. And this is just, once again, a different vines on, but to carry the continuity here, he's pointing out where you want to cut the top off. Now, when you talk about little things you do wrong, one of the biggest errors I've seen done, and yet it's such a simple mistake, is that you want to make very, very sure that where you cut this top off, that you cut it so that the top buds are below this wire. If you reach up here and cut it here, and then these 2 become your cordons, then you've got to bend them down like this to get them onto this wire. And when trying to bend them down, you break them off. You've got, even if you have to come way down here to pick up the ones to form the cordon, you're better off than making the mistake of letting a bud grow above the wire. Now the next 2 or 3 slides will emphasize that because it's an extremely important thing. Next slide. Now here we are showing exactly where to cut it. You see how much is being cut off? About 2 feet or so, and it's being cut right here below the wire, but that's a long internode. Here are the 2 shoots he's going to keep. Going to keep these 2 shoots and cutting there to make very, very sure that you're not cutting it off so that you're going to get a shoot growing close to that wire. And then have to bend it down like this. Okay, next slide. And I say I'm really bearing down on this because it's an extremely important point. Now, where you can make the mistake is if those shears had been just moved up to here, 2 inches above, you'd have been in trouble. Because this would have become the shoot, and this would have been the other shoot. And try bending that down here and tying it while it's nice and young and green and see what happens. That's one of the 200 little points I tell you about, or 1,000 little points in growing grapes. That business there, and I saw a whole vineyard done wrong that way once, so I want to really pound it home. That you do not want to permit any bud to be left anywhere above this wire, even really within a few inches of it, because you've got to bring that over and tie it to the wire. Okay, next slide. And this shows it tied, properly tied. See, we cut through that node to give us a knot there to tie to, but we killed that bud, made a good tie, good hard tie, and here's our beginning of our cordon. Cordon training requires the most skill and the most time and the most money to do it right. That's one of the things you know, so we're showing you this great detail. Okay, next slide. And this is not a very good one, but it shows, I don't like it. I couldn't find the one that's supposed to go into this series because this is one that Dr. Leiter took showing this, but it really is a mistake because you're not supposed to tie them down so that the terminal point out here is tied down flat. The last tie here should have been right here, so that you want these shoots to come out and be tied down gradually, but you want the last terminal 12 inches or so to be allowed to be up, to get polarity effect, to continue to get rapid growth. If you tie this down too severely, as is done here, then that tends to slow down this terminal growth going in this direction and tends to force your lateral buds to start making your cordon too soon. So you want to tie this down just enough to keep it in shape, but much less severely than is done here, leaving the terminal point up so that it'll continue to grow rapidly until you get it as long as you want it. Okay, next slide. Now this is the type of growth that this is where, now, to orient you a little bit, this is where that lateral from this vine has come over this way and has crossed the other one and has gone out that much farther. And this one came up here. This was the vines I said I would talk about later that I got. I got this type of growth by the first week of August down in the Mexico deal, with those very good rootings, a long, hot growing season, plenty of water, good rich fertile soil, and a vigorous variety like Cardinal. So that you let the vines, then you tie them down gradually, leaving the terminals loose like this, and just tying them, letting them grow up this way until well after they've crossed each other, until they've crossed each other by about 18 inches. Then you go in and cut off the ends here to force those laterals, as you'll see in the next slide. And you see here we cut this off, again about 2 feet. Now before, when we were talking about head trained vines or cane pruned vines, we were cutting 2 feet or so off the top part up like this. Now you're cutting 2 feet or so off of the ends of your cordon itself. And notice again that I cut here through a long internode, but left myself as much space here as possible to give a good tight tie. You do not want to cut it right here and then make the tie real tight, because you don't have anything to tie it to. What I started to say, if you cut it here, you can't tie anything, so then you've got to come back and tie it right through here. If you tie it real tight, you're going to girdle that bud. So it's sort of a sloppy operation. You say, well, if I don't want that bud anyway, well, why not just girdle it? Well, it'll still interfere with the nutrition of the rest of the plant here if you're going to leave that terminal bud on there. It's better to leave that long internode to give yourself plenty of tie to tie to, and allow between the last bud here that you're going to have to grow and the last bud over here, leave yourself about 12 to 16 inches, roughly a foot. I say between the spurs on a vine, we like to leave 6 to 8 inches. But in this gap between the ends of them, we like to leave about 12 inches or so. Some people argue 16 inches or so, because the growth habit, as you've seen out there when you training the vines, along in here they'll tend to grow vertically, but out here for some reason they tend to lean this way and lean this way. And pretty soon you've got a rather dense mat of growth, terminal bud effect giving you extra vigor, and then these two tending to grow together, so you want to allow yourself a little extra space in between them.
Split that bud instead of just cutting it off where you did.
Yeah. His comment is, why didn't I go right through the internode there and do it? This is nice if you've got plenty of time and so forth, but as any of you have tried any of this, it takes a little bit of extra time to just exactly split that bud so that you kill it. And if you're doing 100 acres of it and paying $3 an hour, it's better just to tell them to cut off, just whack it behind the node and give yourself that long internode to tie to. Technically you're right, but in time it takes to do that exactly right, just as that top bud on the cordon training. You've got to be just exactly right to give yourself that knot. Otherwise, you're going to leave a bud there and run into that problem I was telling you about. Next slide. Okay, you've done that. We cut that thing off back there in the summertime at each end, and that caused all these laterals to grow nicely. And here you are at the end of the second year in the vineyard, a very healthy, vigorous, cordon-trained vine that started out in the springtime of that year back here with one shoot that you tied up. You brought it up here somewhere. You cut the top off, you saved those two shoots, you tied them up gradually as they went out, let them overlap each other by 2 feet or so. You cut the ends off, leaving yourself a stub to tie to, and then that caused all these nice laterals to grow, which are going to be the origins of your spurs, and then eventually what we refer to as the arms of the cordon. This is the branch of the cordon, remember, in the proper terminology. This will are spurs at the moment, but they will become arms. Okay, next slide. And there you are after that vine is pruned. This is what you've already done in class. And you prune it back Remember, occasionally you can leave a spur, a two-bud spur, in the strong positions, so on, but generally speaking, you'll prune this thing back to leave no spurs at all, but leaving a stub long enough so that you don't dry out those buds at these positions. Remember, you'll leave a part of an inner node just above that, maybe a half an inch or a centimeter long, all along there, but not necessarily a two-bud spur, so that you can protect that. And of course, this is where this vine was cleaned off last year. So there you are, ready to begin the 3rd year in the vineyard. Okay, next slide. And there's what you'll run into out there in June. When you go out to work with those vines, you see, you think you pruned it pretty severely, but if you left those stubs and those spurs the way I told you, you've got that. There's where summer pruning or crown suckering comes in. You've got to clean that out, obviously, because this is where you can get an idea of how you could overcrop. If you just didn't do a thing, you just went fishing and went off for a year's vacation or something and left this stuff here, you can see how those 2 canes with all those shoots on them and all the fruits on there would practically wipe that vine out. It would dwarf it so severely that it might take you several years, if you could ever do it, to bring it back to normal condition. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is just a close-up showing you how it looks before we start to work on it. Next slide. Okay, and here's the way the trunk looks. You see, even though you pulled off those shoots last year, that's still a 1-year-old cane. It's a 1-year trunk, just the same as that is. That's just branches of it. So you've got shoots down here, so you've got to pull all those off and clean out this crotch up in here too. Okay, next slide. And here it shows you a close-up of it being, after it's done. I left out the actual operations in between, but now you've disbudded the trunk. They left one there for some reason. Disbudded the trunk, cleaned out this crotch in here, and cleaned these off. And on a really nicely trained vine, it's usually a situation where you can keep one and take one off, keep one, take one off, keep one, take one off, keep one, and so on. In other words, just about alternate nodes will give you just about the right spacing. So here we are then on this cardinal vine with this was left with 1 good bud, but I tell you on these 1-year-old wood, that bud back in the axil is a good bud. So when you want to leave a spur, you only leave 1 obvious bud out there, because this one back at the axil of the area will also grow in that year. So that is done properly there. Let's see the next slide. And this is showing you the details of some of that, just as a close-up of one entire branch, and showing you how much has been taken off. You see, everything has to come off the bottom, and that takes off half of the load, because I say keep one, take one off, keep one, take one off, keep one, etc. down the line, and this thins you down then to just about the right spacing on the cordon. This is an ideal vine. This is how much you take off, and look at the fruit that's involved. Every one of those shoots has a couple of clusters on it. But still, so do all of these shoots have a couple of clusters on it. And in a position like this, you may have, this is cardinal, extremely fruitful, you may have 5 clusters right here off that one spot. So we got to do something about that. Next slide. That's the same thing, I guess. Okay, go on to the next. And this is a close-up showing you that before it was done. You see you've got shoots on top and then shoots on the bottom, 1 on top, 1 on the bottom, 1 on top, 1 on the bottom. And all they did was just go through and pull off all these on the bottom to give you that nice spacing. Next slide. And this shows you after the operation is done. But look at the amount of fruit on this cardinal vine. See, this one's got a cluster up in here, 1, 2, 3. And this is just going into its 2nd year, or 3rd year now. And every one of those shoots is extremely fruitful. This is cardinal, which I told you is why you have to prune it severely to keep thinning costs down. Okay, that looks pretty good, but you can't leave all that fruit on there. Remember, we've got all together along there about 14 of these shoots going up, and each one with an average of 2 clusters on it. So you've got a terrific amount of crop on that vine. So we still got to thin it some more. Next slide. So this is a close-up showing you how much fruit is on there. You see here's your 2 clusters plus a little one, and 2 clusters here. Okay, next slide. And this shows you how we would thin that shoot. We just pull one off to show you. We take that little one off up there, take this one off, and then keep this one. Although Winkler has often said that he feels it's better to keep the middle one, because this is cardinal, and this doesn't make a nice cluster of fruit frequently with this big division in the cluster. So that really, if you're going to keep this one, then you've got to make another cut and cut one of those off. And you do that for 15 shoots per vine, 500 vines per acre. That adds up to a little extra cost. Winkler's comment is that, as a general rule, he has felt that it's better to cut the top one off, cut the bottom one off, and just keep this one. And then don't worry about that little widow, as they call it, or tendril there. See, it tried to make the same type of cluster as this one here, but it wasn't as well developed. So it's a question then of how you want to do, whether you want to keep the middle cluster and take the top and bottom off. When I'm thinning myself, I try to, I just sort of pick them so that if I leave the middle one here, maybe I'll leave the base one on the next shoot so that they don't, so that they're farther apart and don't tend to intertwine with each other or get tangled together. Okay, next slide. And this shows you, what does it show you? It shows you the amount of clusters removed just in this area here from that vine, even though we've already taken off half the shoots, all that were on the bottom side, and then we thin these down to 2 shoots per position at the most, and then off that we're still taking off this much fruit. Next slide. And that's the way it should look then later on in the summer, when you thin them down, everything off the bottom, and you begin to get these nicely spaced now. This is not the same variety, but it gives you the idea of what you're after. So you go into this thing, you prune them roughly in the wintertime to leave the amount of buds and positions you want. You go through when you're doing this disbudding, suckering time, and get those, do a thinning job then, and then you keep going back, and you'll do it again this next winter. We got about 3 or 4 more slides. Let's see if we can get them. Okay, next slide. This shows that vine. Now at the end of the 3rd growing season, shows that vine. Leave this one in the projector and show the next one how it's pruned, and then flip it back. You see here it's pruned, big positions at the horns. Flip it back, and you can see here with those big horn positions, and you flip it back once again, you'll see how we took care of it by leaving more buds on it. Okay, can you go to the next slide then? And this is just, no, this is what I wanted to show you. Sometimes they cut those cordons short, and when you cut them short, in order to extend them after that, you cut them, if you have to cut them short because they're not long enough and big enough diameter to come out where you want them, you cut them so that your terminal bud is on the bottom. The terminal bud is on the bottom. And then it's easier to tie that up the next year to extend your cordon out to its full length. If you leave the terminal bud on top and then try to pull it down the next year, you have quite a problem getting it back. Okay, next slide. And this is some of the little details of tying up. This is what disgusts me when I see it done in our own vineyards, even out here. This is tying up the end of the cordon. They cut it off so close here to a terminal bud. You can see where it was tending to girdle it. They tied it in that mistake I was telling you about before. Now they got a problem. They don't have anything out here to tie to, so they have to put a sling here to hold it up, rather than tying it the way they should. The next slide, where it was tied here to that long stub, and then you can tie a good tight tie to it. And this can stay here forever now, and it'll hold it up properly. Next slide. And that just shows you an older cordon. Then just to carry the picture a little farther, you see we already begin to get these strong positions. Next slide. And this shows you a cardinal vine in early summer at the time when you have to do one more job, and that is to pull these basal leaves off to expose the fruit so that you can get in to work on them, so that you can put dust and spray materials and so forth on them, and so that you can get good light to get good uniform color development. Next slide. And this is before the leaves are pulled off, and there it is after the leaves are pulled off. So you pull all the leaves off up to and just beyond the fruit to expose the fruit. Next slide. And this shows you the way the fruit looks at the end of the year. Okay, next slide. I think we got about 1 or 2 more. That just shows you an old cordon. If you do this properly, as years go on, you can really take care of them. Next slide. Well, that's all. Okay, you got the picture. That's what you call once over lightly.